Cornfields. Places that seem to be the picture of tranquility, with their tall ears of corn swaying gently in the wind, creating an almost poetic setting. But, when night falls, this serenity transforms into something completely different. Darkness consumes the horizon, the leaves whisper as if they carried secrets, and an unsettling silence takes over the environment. It is at this moment that the familiar becomes strange, and fear begins to arise. Have you ever been in a place where you felt like you were being watched, even when you knew you were alone? Cornfields have this unique ability to stir our imagination. Or maybe it's not just imagination. Behind these tall and seemingly harmless ears of corn, there are stories that defy logic and leave even the most skeptical shivers. And today, you are about to hear 3 of these stories. These accounts are not just inventions to scare. They come from real witnesses, people who swear to have had inexplicable experiences. And while the details may vary, they all share one thing in common: the visceral fear that only those who have been there can describe. Throughout this video, you'll discover what happened to a family who experienced a terrifying event on their farm, how a group of friends had their courage tested by a mysterious presence, and finally, a farmer's terrifying confrontation with something he never imagined he would find. Each story will take you deeper into this dark universe, where cornfields are much more than they seem. And why should you watch until the end? Because in the last story, you'll learn something so disturbing that it may change your perception of what might really be hidden in these places. So, if you like real mysteries and feeling that shiver down your spine, stay with me. But be warned, after hearing these stories, you may think twice before venturing into a cornfield alone, especially at night. In the heart of a small town in the American Midwest, there was a farm surrounded by acres of cornfields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a common landscape for the region, but for the family that lived there, that piece of land hid a secret that would mark them forever. The story begins with the Thompson family, made up of John, his wife Mary, and their 2 children, Clara, 14, and Ethan, 8. They moved to the farm in search of a peaceful new beginning, away from the chaos of the big city. The place seemed perfect, spacious, isolated, and with a robust cornfield that promised good yields. For the first few months, everything went well. The work on the farm was exhausting, but rewarding. During the day, the children played on the edge of the cornfield, while John and Mary tended the crops. At night, the family gathered for dinner and to share stories. It was a simple and happy life. But then, strange things began to happen. It all started with small details that could easily be overlooked. John would often find broken ears of corn in the middle of the cornfield, as if something or someone had passed by. He initially thought it was the work of wild animals, perhaps raccoons or coyotes. However, when he investigated more closely, he found no tracks or signs that would indicate the presence of animals. Things got even stranger when Mary began hearing voices while working near the field. They were soft whispers, impossible to understand but clearly audible. She tried to ignore them, convincing herself that it was just the wind rustling through the leaves, but the whispers continued, always in the same tone, as if someone were watching from afar. The children also began to report unusual things. Clara, who loved to draw, showed her parents a series of illustrations she had made. Strange, shadowy figures among the ears of corn, with eyes that seemed to follow them. When asked what they were, Clara just shrugged and said, "I see them sometimes when I'm outside." Ethan, on the other hand, began to have frequent nightmares. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, saying that something was calling him from the cornfield. Mary and John were worried, but they still tried to find logical explanations for the events. Maybe it was just the stress of the move or the children letting their imaginations run wild. Everything changed one warm summer night. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep and asked his father to go out on the porch with him to look at the stars. John agreed, thinking the fresh air would help the boy relax. As they sat, Ethan pointed to the cornfield and asked, "Did you hear that?" John shook his head, but remained alert. "What did you hear, son?" "Someone called me," Ethan replied, his eyes fixed on the cornfield. John tried to reassure him that it was probably just the wind, but deep down, he felt a chill. The field was eerily quiet that night. No crickets or rustling leaves. There was absolute silence, broken suddenly by a distant sound, a cracking sound, followed by what sounded like muffled laughter. Convinced that it must have been an intruder or an animal, John grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. He asked Ethan to go back inside, but the boy insisted on staying on the porch, promising not to move. As he entered the cornfield, John immediately felt that something was wrong. The tall, dense corn cobs created narrow corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. With the flashlight trembling in his hand, he advanced slowly, calling out to whatever was there. "Who's there? If it's someone, come out." His voice echoed in the silence, but no answer came. Instead, he began to hear whispers. They weren't complete words, but fragments of sound that seemed to come from all sides. As the whispers grew louder, John realized he was lost. He tried to orient himself by the sound of the house, but it was as if the cornfield was shifting around him, closing off the paths he had just crossed. That was when he saw something. A few feet away, a dark, indistinct figure seemed to peer out from between the corn. John froze, his heart pounding wildly. "Who's there?" he called again, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it quickly disappeared into the plants. Terrified, he ran back to the house, following the beams of light from the porch. When he finally emerged from the cornfield, he found Mary and Clara waiting for him, both pale and scared-looking. "Where's Ethan?" Mary asked. The boy had disappeared. Desperate, they searched the house and the surrounding area, but Ethan was nowhere to be found. They called the police and a search was organized. Neighbors and officers searched the cornfield all night, but found no sign of the boy. He was not found until the next morning, sitting silently in the middle of the field. Ethan seemed unharmed, but something was different. His eyes were glassy, and he was not speaking. When he finally began to speak, he kept repeating, "They want to play. They said it's my turn." The family left the farm shortly afterward, unable to cope with the trauma. To this day, what happened that night remains a mystery. Some say the cornfield was haunted, while others believe Ethan saw something the human mind cannot comprehend. Whatever happened, one thing is certain: that cornfield was never the same again for those who knew the story. It was late October, and fall was in full swing. A group of 4 teenage friends, Sarah, Mike, Jenny, and Tom, decided it would be fun to explore the town's famous cornfield. Locally known as the Devil's Maze, the field had a long history of rumors and legends involving disappearances and strange phenomena. To most people, these stories were just fabrications to scare children, but to Sarah, who loved exploring local mysteries, it was the perfect opportunity for an adventure. The plan seemed simple. They would take flashlights and a rudimentary map someone had drawn on a piece of notebook paper, purposefully get lost for a few hours, and then set up makeshift camp in the center of the cornfield. For them, it was an opportunity to prove their courage and, of course, have fun. They arrived at the field at dusk, parking Tom's old pickup truck near the entrance to the maze. As soon as they got out of the vehicle, the cold night wind blew, making the dry corn husks crackle. It was a constant but irregular sound, as if something were moving among the corn cobs. Jenny, the most superstitious of the group, was already suspicious. "I still think this is the worst idea ever. Can't we just go to the movies like normal people?" Jenny said, clutching her flashlight tightly. "Relax, Jen, Mike," the most fearless of the group, replied, "There's nothing here but corn and maybe a few rabbits. You'll survive." With that, they began walking through the cornfield. The first few passages were wide and easy to navigate, with visible marks on the ground indicating where other people had passed. The group laughed and chatted loudly, without any sign of discomfort. But as the darkness deepened and the wind picked up, the atmosphere began to change. About an hour after they entered, they realized they were completely lost. The map they had brought was useless, the passages didn't match the marks drawn, and it seemed like the paths had changed. Sarah, trying to keep up her adventurous spirit, suggested that they should continue in a straight line until they found an exit or something that looked familiar. "That doesn't make sense," Tom said, looking at the map for the umpteenth time. "We haven't walked that far, but it feels like we're in the same place all the time." Jenny, on the other hand, was getting more and more nervous. She started saying that she could hear laughter, but no one took her seriously. "It must be the wind," Sarah said, trying to reassure her. But soon, the others started hearing it too. It was a faint laughter, as if it were coming from far away, but it was there. The sound didn't seem friendly. It was irregular, sometimes muffled, other times clear. The group stopped walking and fell silent. The laughter continued, surrounding them, changing direction as if something or someone was moving among them. "Who's there?" Mike shouted, trying to sound confident, but his voice was shaking. There was no answer, only the sound of laughter, which seemed to be closer now. They decided to pick up the pace, but the paths through the cornfield seemed increasingly narrow and confusing. Tom's flashlight began to fail, flickering irregularly, and Jenny's soon followed suit. Panicked, they began to run, but the sound of laughter grew louder, now accompanied by light footsteps that seemed to follow their movements. "This isn't normal," Sarah shouted, trying to keep everyone together. It was then that Mike tripped over something. When he shone his light on the ground, he saw that there was a small scarecrow lying among the corn cobs. It was a rudimentary doll, made of straw and scraps of old cloth. But what really scared them was its face, a dirty cloth mask, with a grotesque expression crudely painted on it. "Who would do that?" Jenny asked, as everyone backed away. Before they could react, the laughter grew louder, and they saw a figure pass quickly through the corner of their peripheral vision. It was tall and seemed to move unnaturally, disappearing among the corn before they could make out any details. Tom, who was usually the most rational of the group, lost his patience and shouted, "Enough of this! Whoever is doing this, come out now!" The silence that followed was even more terrifying. They waited, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, they decided to keep walking, trying to remain calm. But the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they reached a clearing in the middle of the cornfield. There was a circle of packed earth, completely cleared, as if someone had deliberately moved the plants aside to create the space. In the center, another scarecrow, even more frightening than the first, stood. This one was larger, with long, disproportionate arms, and had a smile sewn into its mask that seemed to mock them. It was then that the lights of the flashlights went out completely. The group panicked, but before they could run, they heard heavy footsteps approaching. Jenny screamed, and then, as if an electric current ran through the air, the laughter began again, this time so loud it was impossible to determine where it was coming from. When the flashlights came back on, Sarah realized that Mike was no longer with them. "Mike, where are you?" she screamed, but there was no answer. The remaining group ran through the maze, calling out to him, but all they heard was the distant echo of laughter. Finally, they found the exit to the cornfield, but Mike never appeared. The authorities were called and a search was organized. The cornfield was searched for days, but no sign of Mike was found. When asked what had happened, none of the friends could give a coherent explanation. The events of that night haunted the survivors forever. Jenny, in particular, never recovered. She swore that in her dreams she could still hear the laughter and sometimes see a grotesque face peering out from between the corn stalks. As for the cornfield, it was destroyed years later to make way for a new development. But to this day, local residents say they hear laughter coming from that direction, especially on October nights. In the quiet town of Cold Hollow, there was a cornfield that everyone avoided. It wasn't because the land was unproductive or unkempt. Quite the opposite. The field was lush with tall ears and lush green leaves. The problem was the dark reputation that surrounded it. It was said that the field was watched by something, an invisible presence that punished anyone who dared to trespass on its rows. The story begins with David Carter, an 18-year-old boy who worked on the farm next to the mysterious cornfield. David was a skeptic by nature and never believed in the local legends. To him, the field was just an ordinary patch of land, and the stories were created to scare children. He often heard the older residents talk about the cornfield watcher, a figure who supposedly appeared to protect the field from intruders. According to the stories, the watcher was a tall, hooded shadow that could materialize at any time, appearing among the cornfields to drive out anyone who entered its territory. Although no one knew exactly what it was, those who claimed to have seen the entity never returned to the field. David didn't believe any of these stories, but that all changed one summer night when he decided to challenge the legends. It was a silly bet with his friends. They were gathered around a campfire, sharing scary stories, when the subject of the field came up. One of his friends, Jake, challenged David. "If you're so brave, why don't you go out there and pick an ear of corn? I bet you don't have the guts." David laughed and accepted immediately. To him, there was nothing scary about the field, just exaggerated stories from superstitious people. Without hesitation, he grabbed a flashlight and walked through the fence that bordered the cornfield. As soon as he entered, he noticed how different the place was at night. During the day, the fields looked ordinary, but in the dim light of the moon, there was something unsettling about the silence. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was as if the entire field was watching. David walked for a few minutes, following the perfectly aligned rows, until he found an ear of corn that looked ripe. He plucked it, putting it in his backpack as proof of his courage. That was when he heard it. It was a low, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of leaves being trampled. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the sound was rhythmic, like footsteps. David stopped, shining his flashlight around, but saw nothing but the ears of corn dancing softly. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound confident. No answer. David laughed nervously and kept walking, but the footsteps seemed to follow him, getting closer and closer. He quickened his pace, but the sound also grew louder. It was then that he noticed something disturbing. The ears of corn around him were swaying, but there was no wind. He pointed his flashlight at a specific spot and froze. Between the plants, the silhouette of a tall, hooded figure appeared. There was no face, just a towering shadow that seemed to absorb all the light around it. David ran. He didn't know where he was going, but he kept moving, pushing the corn cobs aside to make way. The figure seemed to be everywhere, appearing in front of him and disappearing before he could dodge. It was as if the cornfield was alive, manipulating the paths to confuse him. Finally, he saw the fence that marked the exit and ran towards it. As he crossed it, he fell to the ground, gasping for breath. When he looked back, the field was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. His friends, who had been waiting anxiously, laughed and called him a coward for coming back so quickly. "Did you at least get the corn?" Jake asked. David opened his backpack, but the cob was gone. That night, David had terrible nightmares. He dreamed that he was trapped in the cornfield, running in circles while the hooded figure followed him. When he finally woke up, he realized that he wasn't the only one who had been affected. His friends, who had challenged him, began to report strange occurrences. Jake said he came home to find corn cobs scattered around his living room, all with burn marks. Another friend reported hearing footsteps in the yard at night, but never found anyone. David tried to forget what had happened, but the field seemed to refuse to leave him alone. Every time he walked past it, he had the feeling that something was watching. One day, while working on the neighboring farm, he saw something that terrified him. In the center of the field, there was a hooded figure, motionless, staring right at him. He told the farm owner, Mr. Grayson, an elderly man who had lived there for decades. Grayson shook his head, as if he already knew exactly what David was talking about. "I warned you, kid. That field is no ordinary place. My father used to tell me that the Watcher is there to protect something, but no one knows what. Whatever it is, it's best to leave it alone." David tried to follow the advice, but the presence continued to haunt him. He began to see the figure in his dreams and sometimes in real life, always distant but unmistakable. A few months later, David decided to leave Cold Hollow. He thought that by getting away, he could escape whatever it was. But the night before he was to leave, something happened. He woke up in the middle of the night to a sound coming from outside. When he looked out the window, he saw footprints leading from his door to the cornfield, as if something had come to get him. On the ground at the entrance to his house was a single ear of corn. David never told anyone what happened that night. He left town at dawn and never returned. To this day, the Cold Hollow cornfield remains abandoned. No one dares to cultivate it, and the ears grow wild, forming a natural maze. The few who venture near it report feeling a heavy presence, as if they are being watched. As for the Watcher, he is still there, patiently waiting for anyone brave enough, or foolhardy enough, to challenge his territory. The cornfields, so present in our lives and landscapes, hold secrets that go beyond what we can see. These stories you've just heard are just 3 examples of how normalcy can be shattered by something inexplicable, frightening, and sometimes inescapable. In the end, what is so terrifying about these seemingly harmless fields? Maybe it's the sense of isolation, the vastness that engulfs us as we walk between the rows. Or maybe it's the silence, a silence so absolute that any sound, no matter how small, becomes a harbinger of something terrible. The mystery and darkness of these places force us to confront the unknown, and that's where our most primal fears lie hidden. The stories of Amy, the maze group of friends, and David share a common theme. They all underestimated the power of the unknown. They entered the fields with confidence, believing they were in control, but they quickly discovered that this was not the case. Each was confronted by forces that defied logic and natural laws, leaving an indelible mark on their lives, or ending them entirely. These legends make us wonder, what is it about these fields that attracts so many horror stories? Are they just fabrications, the fruit of overactive imaginations? Or is there something darker, something hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? The most intriguing thing about these stories is that for every person who doesn't believe them, there is another who swears they have experienced something similar. Locals continue to report strange sounds, sights, and experiences that defy logical explanation. This raises an important question. What is scarier? The idea that these stories are true, or the fact that, if they are not, someone must have made them up? Whatever your opinion, one thing is certain. The cornfield will continue to fuel our imaginations. It's the perfect stage for the unexplainable, a place where the rules of the world don't seem to apply, where time and space become distorted, and where our worst nightmares can come to life. Now, I leave you with a warning. If you're ever walking through a cornfield and feel like you're not alone, or if you hear distant laughter or soft footsteps behind you, think twice before continuing. Sometimes, there's good reason to fear what we can't see. And if you're brave enough, share your experience in the comments. Maybe your story will be the next one we tell here? Thanks for watching, and until next time, be careful as you explore the unknown. So, what did you think of these stories? Have you ever felt that inexplicable chill when passing through a cornfield? Or perhaps you heard strange sounds while walking alone at night? These common places, which seem harmless, often hide dark mysteries that are just waiting to be revealed. Now it's your turn to be part of this conversation. If you have a spine-chilling story, whether about cornfields or any other enigmatic place, share it in the comments. We want to hear your experiences, your stories, and your fears. Who knows? Maybe your story will be the next one to be told here on the channel. And don't forget, if you like the video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content. Here, we explore the unknown, bring real stories and delve into the shadows of the inexplicable. Your participation is the fuel that motivates us to continue. Oh, and one last thing. Share this video with that friend who thinks that nothing can scare him. Let's see if he remains as brave after hearing these stories. Thank you for watching and for being part of this community that is not afraid to look at the dark side of reality. Until next time. And remember, the unknown may be closer than you think.